Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. In the Belly of the Beast, Volume 4, Story Number 1. I want to share some experiences I had a few years ago. I just want to mention a few key points before I share some of the things that happened. I'm not looking for fame nor attention, and everything contained within is 100% factual. I'm an Australian. These occurrences happen on the central coast of New South Wales. I'm an avid outdoorsman with a keen interest and an in-depth knowledge of Australian native fauna. Each of these occurrences have a witness apart from myself. I don't claim these events are paranormal, yet I am to this day still without a reasonable explanation. The first occurrence. I lived on New South Wales Central Coast in an area that has houses in close proximity to Brisbane Water National Park, literally within meters from some back fences. Myself and my partner hold a keen interest which sees us venture into bushland regularly. For argument's sake, let's say we are avid bird watchers. A few weeks ago, the local fire service commenced backburning in parts of the Brisbane Water National Park over 2 or so days, which is obviously for hazard reduction. Most of the fire was directed at burning off leaf litter and dry debris, which covers the ground in an effort to reduce the chances of spot fires, which have in the past become large fires and threatened houses and caused neighboring suburbs to be evacuated. Because of the way the backburning was controlled, it completely burned off the debris, and basically 90% of flora that was over 2 or so feet seemed to have survived, except some charring, of course. Even some grass plants survived. Others were completely burned, including their underground roots, which left large round circles in the substrate. This meant the canopy was fully intact. This is an important point in my story. The fire was controlled so well that the left-hand side was completely obliterated by fire, while the right-hand side was untouched. The path is about 3 or 4 feet wide at its widest points. Anyway, about 48 hours after the fire service had finished backburning, my partner and myself ventured into a large patch of Brisbane Water National Park along a track we had walked no less than 200 times in the last 10 years. The first thing we noticed, of course, was the lack of small shrubs and ground cover, which had been replaced by 3 to 4 centimeter layers of ash. It was also hard not to notice the smell and non-visible smokiness which irritated our throats and noses, but by far the most profounding thing we noticed was just how quiet it was. Usually we hear birds chirping, snakes slithering into the underbrush, lizards scampering out of the way, and ducks splashing around the creek that runs along the whole length of the walking track on the right. Across the creek there are literally kilometers of bush in all directions, so it was a little odd that it was so desolate even after backburning. We decided to press on even though we were pretty sure that we weren't going to see any wildlife. We continued along the track for about another 20 minutes, all the while chatting about nothing in particular, when all of a sudden we both jerked our heads to the left to see 2 vertical vines which stand about 6 feet tall and 4 centimeters or so in circumference come towards us like they had been shook, held back, and released towards us, kind of like a slingshot. We immediately ran over to the trees, 4 meters or so off the track, because we thought it may have been caused by wildlife. My first instinct was to look up, as it may have been a large bird fleeing, but there were no birds at all in any of the trees, and we would have seen and heard the wing flapping and it breaking through the canopy. It wasn't any type of goannas. We only have 2 types, which occur naturally here, and both are arboreal and will take to the nearest tree when threatened. We checked every tree, every hollow log, and any type of ground cover which survived the fire and found nothing. It definitely wasn't any type of marsupial, because it would have been spotted when we checked the trees and surrounding ground cover. It also wasn't any type of snake, as the only arboreal snake we have locally, which weighs in kilos, is a diamond python, which I could spot from a mile away. We continued walking for another 3 kilometers or so along the track. And the whole time felt like we were being watched, and I was quite uneasy, but that feeling completely left as soon as we turned around and backtracked and headed towards home. Now, the second occurrence and the third one, I believe this is the first time that I've really thought about what happened. My partner and myself went out on another adventure, but this time we were looking for nocturnal animals to photograph. We went to a waterfall which was only about 15 minutes from our house, but it is rather secluded and completely dead at night, especially on weekdays. Funnily enough, it becomes packed on the weekends during the day in the warmer months. The layout of the waterfall is basically a large parking lot at the top of the waterfall, which has a small park with barbecues, tables, and a small block of toilets. From the parking lot, you can also access the very top of the waterfall, which is basically a rock escarpment with water running through it. You can also access stairs that take you down to both the middle of the waterfall, which is just a huge rock platform, and the very bottom of the waterfall. It takes about 20 minutes to walk from top to bottom. Anyway, we parked the car and I grabbed my gear, which included my camera. We started making our way towards the top of the falls, which has a 2-foot barrier you have to step over to access the rock escarpment. Right as I went to put my leg over the fence, I heard the most disturbing noise I've ever heard. It sounded like a human moaning in pain, but to describe it the best I can, imagine having 10 different people with 10 different voice qualities, all making the same moaning sound at the same time. I'm not one to frighten easily, but I have to admit it sent chills up my spine. I told my partner to hurry up and get back to the car, and I locked the doors as soon as we got in and left in a hurry. Now, this place is pitch dark. There are zero lights, and there is no way in hell you'd be there without a torch. Not to mention, you'd be able to tell if anyone was there by the cars parked in the parking lot, as this isn't a place you'd walk to. When I told a close friend of mine, who also frequents the waterfall to photograph wildlife, he told me he also had an experience the night before. This was the night after I was there. He had finished work late and thought he'd go for a quick walk around to see what he could find. This was in the Australian spring when everything is out and about due to the warm and humid weather. He said he had parked his car and got about halfway down the stairs to the bottom of the falls when he came across a snake. He was photographing it when he heard the door of the toilet block being slammed repeatedly. He started running up the steps to get back to his car and said as he was running up it sounded like something was going mental, slamming things within the toilet block. He got in his car and left. My friend and I decided to go check out the waterfall that night to see if we could find anything. We parked the car and went straight to the toilet block. We checked the block that he heard the commotion in and found a reasonable amount of blood inside the basin and a small pool in the basin's soap dish. We contemplated calling the police, but weren't sure exactly what we would say. We left soon after. Neither of us visited the place for about a month afterwards. Since then, we have been back to this place multiple times without incident. The fourth occurrence. This was the last one. Now, on the last night, we headed out along a road on the central coast, which by day is rather busy due to the high number of residences and farms that are along this road. By night, it is usually very quiet, with a few cars using it sporadically, so I had my high beams on 95% of the time. We drove along this road for about 40 minutes in search of marsupials to photograph. This road intersects large masses of bush on both sides. I would also like to add at this point that this road is not straight or level by any means. There are a mixture of turns as well as light to aggressive inclines and declines along basically the entirety of the road. After driving for 40 minutes, without any luck, we decided to head back along the same route we took. We were driving for about 10 or 15 minutes on our way back when we hit one of the very slight gradual inclines along the road. When we were about halfway up the incline, I noticed something in the distance, maybe 200 or 250 meters or so, which I initially thought was a shadow being cast from residual lighting of my high beams. When all of a sudden, it moved from the middle of the road to the right side. At this point, and while the figures were still in motion, I asked the passenger and the person who had been present for the third unexplained experience, "Can you see that?" To which they replied, "Yes, what is that?" We got to the top of the incline and onto level ground once again and stopped in the location we saw it. I stopped and I pulled out one of my torches and surveyed where we had seen it. To my surprise, what had crossed to us a small property, which was essentially a house with a very small paddock with horses out the front. But what caught my attention was the horses were not startled in the slightest, and could actually see one of them close to the fence eating. After about 2 minutes of surveying the area, I continued along the road and asked my passenger exactly what they had seen. They relayed exactly what I had seen, which was a tall, about 6 feet or so tall, but with about 2.5 feet wide profile, but rounded. It's very hard to gauge an exact height because since we were on an incline, for instance, say a person was to walk in that exact spot, we would only be able to see from the knees up due to the blind spot on the summit. My passenger added another piece of information, which was that it was rusty colored. I didn't see any color, but have to admit that I was paying as much attention to the road as I was to the figure, and as I was traveling at approximately 70 kilometers per hour, I really had to keep my attention on the road while trying to get to the summit as quick as possible to see what it was. I would also like to add another detail, which I find is rather strange. While I couldn't see the figure's complete leg area, it didn't seem to be walking in a normal fashion. It was almost like it was gliding. I know that seems odd. Across the road. If I had to liken the body shape to a known animal, it would definitely without a doubt be an orangutan, but standing a fair bit taller and not as hunched in the lower back area. So there you have it. I no longer live in that area. I now live 40 minutes north of there, but still visit often due to family there. I'd like to point out that all of the above happened within about a 6-week period, which all seem to start with hazard reduction backburning. Australian summers are harsh. I've not had any weird experiences since then, and I still spend a ridiculous amount of my time out in the bush. I will not give away my profession, but I will say I'm in a scientific field that works with wildlife. A scientific field which claims animals such as the above are not endemic to Australia. Story number 2. To begin with, I'm not crazy, nor am I hallucinating. I'm not selling anything, so you don't have to buy anything. I habitually rise early around 4 a.m. most days, and my custom is to go outside and light my pipe just before the sun rises. That morning I was outside with a cup of tea just before dawn. I was thumbing a bowl of tobacco in my pipe when I heard a shuffling toward the pine trees at the edge of my property. The back of my house faces the edge of a thick lot of short pine trees, and I see critters run in and out of it all the time. So I assumed the noise was an armadillo or something. But when I looked up, I saw what looked like an obese woman with sagging breasts, but her head was kind of like an odd lump on the shoulders. Very small and without hair or features, like a typical head. I immediately knew it wasn't an animal of any sort, and I set my things down on the patio table and called out to her. There was just enough light from the floodlights on my house to see a large bare bottom turn and run away. I could very easily hear the thumping sound of feet in the pine. I called the police right then and there and told them what I'd seen. 3 county deputies responded within 20 minutes, and they scoured my entire property and searched around the edge of the pine trees. For over an hour, I recalled what I'd seen, giving them every detail I could remember. None of us could come up with any explanation, as I know all of my closest neighbors personally. I have only 2 neighbors, and a lot of pine trees itself is 20 plus acres, and connects to a stretch of grassland where the closest humans would be whoever is on the interstate. I urged them to search the pines, convinced there was a naked woman running around in there. Methamphetamine and other harsh drugs are not unknown where I live, and in my years living in this region, have seen my share of crazed addicts. The deputies told me they couldn't search just then, and that they would need help. They filed a report and told me to go inside and lock my doors. So I did. I also retrieved my pistol from the bedroom and stuck it in my waistband. Around 1 p.m., a new lot of deputies came knocking, and I walked them around exactly where I'd seen this person. 2 of them hung back with me while the others went into the pines looking around. They spent about a half hour in there before they came back with no evidence or explanation. They were all very helpful, but didn't sound very concerned, and eventually left after scanning around my backyard a bit too. I told my sister and close friends about the incident, and we all speculated for a while about it. Every morning since then, when I went out to have my morning smoke, my eyes were fixed on the pines, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary until I was up late one night. As an early riser, I typically fall asleep in my chair around 9 p.m. as I'm getting up in years and don't have the stamina I once had. But one night, I'd been entertaining guests and had made a pot of strong coffee, so I couldn't sleep. I'm normally a tea drinker, so I'm somewhat sensitive to coffee strength. It was around 1 a.m. and my friends had left around an hour before. I cleaned up a bit, then stepped out back with a glass of wine to have a smoke. I turned the back lights on and stepped out, and I immediately saw the fat woman again. This time, I could see her much better. When the dim light hit her body, she moved like a dog would if it had suffered an injury. It was a natural lope for an animal, but not for a human. I could see her face this time, but it looked like she didn't have a nose, and her head was entirely too small for her large body. She loped into the pines again, but this time I ran towards her as fast as my legs could carry me. I have very little cartilage left in my knee, so it wasn't very fast. I heard her shuffling away into the pines just as I reached the tree line. Then I called the police. They said they were on their way, so I went back inside, turned on all the outside lights, and grabbed a flashlight and my pistol. I told them everything I'd seen, and again, everything I'd seen before, and this time they went deep in the pines. I could see their flashlights flickering around, and they finally came back and said they couldn't find anything. They advised me again to lock my doors and keep my gun close at hand. After the police left, it was almost 3 a.m. And when I went inside, my cat Augustus was growling at the back window. His tail was twice its normal size, and he was in a fit mood. I decided to try to nap in my big chair, hoping my cat would join me, but we were both too nervous. Just before dawn, I'd almost fallen asleep when Augustus began growling loudly again and slapping at the small window. I turned on the lamp and got a full glimpse of the half-face of the large woman. I knew it was her immediately. Her face has holes where a nose should be and swollen lips. Her eyes were dark brown all over and not like normal eyes. I got up and yelled, pointing my pistol at her, and she turned and ran. I saw her scramble away through the window, then went to the patio door and turned the lights on so I could see better. Her breasts were swinging in the mass of her body as she ran towards the pines. I opened the door and fired 2 shots towards the top of the pines. I had no desire to harm her, but I wanted to put the fear in her that I was armed and done playing around. I'm not a young man, and I live alone, but with a faithful cat and several guns. I again called the police. Only this time I went to their office to speak to a detective. She was more than helpful and said they would patrol the area regularly, and that if someone was running around out there, they would catch her. This was in January, and I didn't have any more problems except for my guard cat and I not being able to sleep very well at night. I haven't seen her since then, but I know in my heart now she isn't really a woman but something else. It's been 3 weeks since I've last heard from the police, but lately I have the feeling that she's still out there. Augustus and me are ready if she comes back, though he is much braver than I am. I'm thinking about moving away. It's now March 4th. Now, this happened in March. As a matter of fact, March 17th. Tonight, one of my neighbors came to my house, the closest of the two from me. I don't want to say any names because he's a genuine guy and I like him a lot. But I've known him for a few years now and I trust him. I'm going to talk to him more later today. My neighbor went on asking me if I had heard screaming and loud thud sounds coming from the pine sprawl. I said I hadn't and told him I'd been listening to music on my laptop most of the evening, so I wouldn't have heard anything. But I did mention that my cat had been darting around and that might have been him hearing those sounds. Both of my neighbors know about what happened to me as I went directly to their doors to tell them about it. I wanted them to be aware, and now my neighbor is hearing what he described as definitely human screams and thuds that sounded like trees falling, but without the snapping sound of branches. I told him to load a gun and keep an ear out for anything else. Me and Augustus have gotten comfortable now in the living room, and we don't take chances anymore. I'm going to talk to my neighbor more, including my furthest neighbor, later today. I'll keep you updated. Now, I didn't have to wait long. This is what happened today. I was up very late listening to music, another tool I use for settling my nerves. I don't sleep in my bedroom anymore and have started sleeping on my couch or in my big chair, so when Wayne knocked on my door around 1 a.m. asking if I had heard the screaming or the big thud sounds, I told him I hadn't because I had been listening to music and had not looked at my phone when he said he tried to call me a bunch but saw my lights on, so he came over. I told him to load a gun and sleep lightly. I did the same because it was strange to see Wayne so late. Wayne owns a building materials business, so he's an early riser like me. I slept for 6 hours and got to make up some breakfast and feed Augustus. Wayne called me not long after saying that the police had been to our far neighbor's house and that they were in the field and in the pines. Wayne had not slept and had breakfast made, so he invited me to eat. I crossed the giant grass lot that separates our property, and I could see police in the field walking around. Over breakfast, Wayne called a neighbor again and asked if we could stop by, and he said he wanted to talk to us. Our furthest neighbor is a younger man in his 30s, and he's a good no-nonsense fellow made of hard stuff, but he looked really tired and shaken when Wayne and I got there. He and his girlfriend were dozing off when they were startled by shrill screaming and thrashing at their back door. He said it was like a giant fish flopping on the door, and horrible screaming. Their door was something awful. There was major damage to it and deep gashes and mud. They said the thrashing at the back stopped and it was quiet for a minute. As he was getting dressed to go investigate, something slammed itself against the bedroom window and screamed against the glass. His poor girlfriend described it as a throat scream that could have come from a man or a woman. They were both very shaken but were putting on brave faces. He said he grabbed his shotgun and ran outside immediately. He said he heard the screaming getting further away along the edge of the pines toward Wayne's property. He didn't see anything. The deputies were still walking around outside, and a few of them I recognized. Sure enough, that detective I spoke to kept her word, and they had been patrolling the area closely all this time. So they arrived fairly quickly, my neighbor said. The loud thuds that Wayne heard could not be explained, but we had made plans to hike deep through the pines and explore. We all and the deputies had a long talk on my far neighbor's property. In the end, they believed it to be animals or possible malicious mischief. I think from the tone of one of them they suspected Wayne or myself of playing a prank on them in the night, but they didn't directly accuse us. They left us with the advice that we find someone sneaking around our property at night, acting aggressive and strange to do with what we feel is necessary for our safety. We have agreed to keep in close contact with each other from now on, and to immediately send texts whenever something happens so we can assist. Now, a day later, I was eating some breakfast, and Wayne and I made plans to go to the pines when the sun rose to have a look around. The idea was to search as much as we could in the daytime and see if we could find anything, something that we could take pictures of. Of course, we'll both be armed. Now, a few days later after that, I returned with Wayne, and we explored for almost 9 hours, and I took pictures of what I found. All I will say about them is that I'm looking for a new place to live right now. Next story. These are encounters with strange beasts, clearly that diverge off into more bizarre territory, presenting creatures that seem to be more than just undiscovered species of some sort, but rather something more mysterious. One such account allegedly occurred in December 17th, 1974, when a platoon of soldiers were out on a search and destroy mission along a river just north of the DMZ in the early morning hours. The platoon had penetrated through a heavily wooded river bank to reach a clearing, and it was then that they noticed that the area was strangely silent and devoid of the typical jungle sounds and its incessant drone of insects, animals, and birds. Sensing that this was bad news, a scout was sent ahead to see if enemies were in the vicinity, but nothing was found, not even any tracks. In the meantime, as the eerie, almost oppressive silence continued, some piles of what appeared to be dung from some large, unidentified animal were found scattered about the clearing, and as the soldiers examined them, we heard crashing sounds from the thick brush. The platoon allegedly looked up to see several large humanoid creatures, some lumbering out of the trees and brush, which were unlike anything any of them had ever seen. The creatures were estimated as being around 8 feet in height, with a bright yellow coloration and 3-fingered hands that ended in wicked-looking talons. The faces of these strange beasts were flat and sported large eyes with only a couple of slits for a nose. These giant yellow-skinned beings were reported as passing right by the platoon, seemingly not even paying any attention to them at all. But when the frightened soldiers began to get out of there, the loud sounds of crushing brush could be heard behind them, and they realized that whatever the creatures had been were following them. As the increasingly unsettled men picked up their pace and broke into a run, the crashing became more frantic and ominous, as if the giants were closing in for the kill. Several of the men reportedly fired their weapons at their pursuers to no apparent effect, with the creature barely flinching even when hit with armor-piercing rounds. The men were now running as fast as they could towards their boat, moored at the riverside, sporadically firing ineffectually behind them as the beast closed in. They finally reached their boat and beat a hasty retreat, and as they left they purportedly saw the hunting sight of dozens of the huge humanoids gathered on the shore watching them leave. What in the world did these men see? We may never know. An equally bizarre account was given by an anonymous U.S. Army corporal in the Vietnam War, who claimed that he had a very strange encounter in 1970 in a region of South Vietnam, about 30 miles south of the DMZ. According to the man, he had been second in command of a platoon of soldiers, and they had just set up their camp in a heavily forested area marked with steep hills. After setting it up that evening, the platoon engaged in a patrol of a small valley near the camp and detected movement ahead. Thinking it might be an enemy patrol, the soldiers hid it and waited for around 15 minutes, during which time they continued to witness sporadic furtive activity through the trees. Although visibility was poor and there was not enough light to make out who or what was causing it, the movement eventually ceased and the squad warily continued on their mission, with only the light of the full moon to guide them. Jungle patrol in the Vietnam War, at some point the platoon supposedly came across a wall of what appeared to be boulders that had been stacked one on top of another smack in the middle of a pass between 2 steep hills. On the side of this sheer wall was a dark opening that looked as if it could be the entrance of a cave, about 5 feet in height and 3 feet wide. When the men drew closer, they could see that the surface of the opening was smooth, as if it had been carefully carved away by hand or bored by machinery of some sort. Although the Viet Cong enemy were well known to utilize tunnels and caves, none of the men had ever seen a cave opening quite like this one. Things got stranger still when they drew near and detected a rancid stench coming from the murky blackness within, which was described as being so gut-wrenchingly putrid that some of the soldiers felt strongly sick to their stomachs and backed away in revulsion. Light shone into the maw of the cave, did very little to eliminate what lay within the dank space or what was producing that bad stench, and it was finally decided that they would fall back to around 150 feet away from the entrance and stake out the entrance for a time to see what would happen. As the platoon waited there, observing the cave opening, it was noticed that the night was unusually quiet and eerily calm, with a noticeable absence of the usual jungle sounds that should have been all around them. The only thing they could hear was unidentified deep rumbling sounds, seeming to come from somewhere off in the distance, and the whole atmosphere was described as being quite unsettling indeed. They would wait there the entire night without incident, and as dawn approached at 0500 hours, as the first light made its appearance, some movement was finally spied at the darkened cave entrance. The soldiers tensed up, and what at first was assumed to be a man emerged from the cave to crouch in the clearing in front of the cave's maw. However, it was soon noticed, as it stood up, that whoever it was around 7 feet in height and moved in a very odd manner. The platoon became firmly aware that the thing was not human, just as another came stalking out from the cave. It was at this time that they were both claimed to start making hellish hissing sounds. As they watched on, it could be discerned that the creatures looked like bipedal humanoid lizards, with scaly, shiny skin described as being so dark as to be practically obsidian black in color. The arms and legs were human-like, but scaly and tipped with claws. The faces had very large forward-set eyes and were said to look like snake eyes. No tails were visible, and both of the beings were clearly wearing clothing of some sort in the form of dark green robes. What happened next was sudden and abrupt, a chaos that the witnesses described this way. No one gave the order. It seemed like the entire squad opened fire at once. Every piece of vegetation between us and them was quickly sheared away. I yelled out a ceasefire order. At the same time, I was looking in the direction of the cave. There was nothing there. We immediately checked our flank in case these things circled around us, but there was nothing. As we approached the cave, ready to resume action if needed, it became apparent that the beings had escaped, most likely back into the cave. It was soon decided to set charges and close the cave entrance. When we returned to camp, we all seemed to be in a daze. There was little discussion of the incident, and we never debriefed, so I know the sergeant never filed a report. Then again, if he did, it was kept quiet by the brass. It's hard to know how to classify this particular report. Was this just a tall tale? Was it some sort of subterranean lost civilization? Was it aliens? Who knows? One report that does seem to suggest aliens is another case from 1967. On October 12th of that year, a 6-man long-range recon patrol was operating in a heavily jungled region near the North Vietnam border, and they set up camp a night defense perimeter that evening, with the men taking turns sleeping as the others maintained a lookout for the enemy. At around 1:45 a.m., the leader of the patrol was on watch and claimed that he saw movement nearby, after which he woke the other men and they prepared their weapons for a potential firefight. As the patrol geared up and turned their eyes to the dark jungle, a very strange creature emerged from the murk. It was described as looking like a small gray humanoid with enormous black eyes, a long face, and slender arms, which gave off a faint glow that pushed back the clinging darkness around it. One of the men allegedly did not hesitate to fire at the creature, hitting it squarely in the head to send a brilliant blue syrupy fluid spattering the foliage. At that moment, 3 lights appeared in the sky to form a perfect triangle before darting off into the night sky. It would later become known that 2 other recon teams operating in the area had similar strange encounters that evening, and the headquarters were claiming that it was hard to keep the radio contact due to some sort of communication disturbance. Aliens or a tall tale? Some strange accounts from the war are a bit harder to classify, and one of these is certainly the case of what has become mostly to be known as the Bird Woman of Da Nang. It was most famously recounted by John Keel in his Mothman Prophecies, in which he credits the source as being FSR Case Histories, number 10, June 1972. In the summer of 1969, a private first class of the Marine Corps by the name of Earl Morrison was sitting on top of a bunker near Da Nang with 2 others on guard duty, when they claimed to have seen something unlike anything they had ever experienced before. At first it started as a weird glow in the sky, the source indiscernible, but as it drew closer they could make out that it was some sort of flying humanoid with bat-like wings. As it slowly moved closer, certain features could be ascertained. The creature seemed to be in the form of a naked woman, with flowing long hair and totally black skin that cast an eerie greenish glow around it. The entity was described as being completely silent and as flying very slowly and purposefully. Morrison would say of the odd light, there was a glow on her and around her. Everything glowed. Looked like she glowed and threw off a radiance. We saw her arms towards the wings, and they looked like regular molded arms, each with a hand and fingers and everything, but they had skin from the wings going over them. And when she flapped her wings, there was no noise at first. It looked like her arms didn't have any bones in them because they were limber just like a bat. The strange entity inexorably came closer as a shocked man looked on, unsure of what to do, until it was hovering a mere 6 or 7 feet above their head, so close that she blotted out the moon. None of them knew what to do, and all they could do was stare with mouths open, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The entire time they could hear no sound from the creature, and it was not until she was continuing on her way that they could make out the faint sound of her wings flapping. The entire encounter was reported as lasting between 3 and 4 minutes. Interestingly, Vietnam folklore speaks of what are referred to as night flyers, which are winged humanoids usually described as being women, and which are said to swoop down to attack the unwary. The Vietnam War was certainly a time of great turmoil and horror for the people who served there. Here, among all of the wartime experiences, there are truly represented the full range of the human emotional spectrum. Yet buried with tales of death and scattered about the numerous accounts of fighting, heroism, and atrocity are some tales that seem to transcend the usual war stories, to firmly entrench themselves into the realm of the truly bizarre. Besides the human monsters of war, there seem to be these cases which point to very literal monsters indeed. We know that armed conflict can be a turbulent time, full of strangeness, but cases like these show that it can be even stranger than we may at first think, and that lodged within the history we know of are dark things that go bump in the night and which defy explanation to remain conundrums upon the bloody landscape of war.